The morning sun peeked through the worn curtains of Martha Johnson's small apartment in Brooklyn. At 78 years old, her movements were slower than they once were, but her mind remained sharp as ever. She hummed softly while making her breakfast, 2 pieces of toast with a thin layer of strawberry jam and a cup of tea with just a splash of milk. Every Tuesday for the past 15 years, rain or shine, Martha made the journey to the Little Stars Community Center in Harlem. She had been a school teacher for over 40 years before retiring, and she couldn't bear the thought of not helping children learn to read. Reading opens doors, she would often say with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. Martha checked her watch, 9:15 a.m. Perfect timing. She carefully placed her medication in her purse, along with her wallet that contained exactly $67, a photo of her late husband Thomas, and a more recent picture of a handsome blond man with his arm around her shoulders. Few people knew about her special relationship with this man, and Martha preferred it that way. The air outside was crisp with early autumn coolness. Martha pulled her faded blue coat tighter around her small frame as she walked the 3 blocks to the subway station. Her knees protested a bit on the stairs going down, but she gripped the railing firmly and took her time. The station wasn't too crowded, just a handful of people going about their Tuesday business. Martha approached the ticket machine, opening her warm leather purse to retrieve her wallet. She counted out the money for her Metro card, her fingers slightly stiff from arthritis. 25, 50, 55, she counted under her breath, not noticing the young man who had paused his pacing to watch her from several feet away. He was thin, maybe in his early 20s, wearing a gray hoodie pulled low over his face. His eyes followed Martha's hands as she counted her money, noting how carefully she placed her wallet back in her purse after purchasing her ticket. Martha slipped the Metro card into her coat pocket and made her way toward the platform, her sensible shoes making soft tapping sounds against the concrete floor. The community center was expecting her by 10:30. Today she was going to read The Tale of Peter Rabbit to the kindergarten group and then help some of the older children with their reading comprehension. The platform was eerily quiet for a Tuesday morning. Only an elderly man reading a newspaper, a woman typing furiously on her phone, and a maintenance worker sweeping the far end of the platform. Martha settled herself on a bench, placing her purse beside her. She took out a small notebook and began reviewing her notes for today's reading session. The young man in the gray hoodie appeared on the platform, seemingly interested in the arrival time board. But his eyes kept darting toward Martha, taking in her vulnerability, the way she sat alone, how no one seemed to be paying attention to her. Martha looked up briefly when she heard footsteps approaching, offering a polite smile. She had always believed in seeing the good in people. In her decades of teaching in tough neighborhoods, she had learned that kindness often disarmed even the most troubled souls. "Train's running late again," she commented to no one in particular, glancing at her watch. She needed to call the center if she was going to be significantly delayed. The children would be waiting for their reading lady. The rumble of an approaching train vibrated through the station. Martha gathered her things, standing up slowly and adjusting her purse strap on her shoulder. She didn't notice how the young man had moved closer, his hands now shoved deep in his pockets, his body tense like a coiled spring. As the train's headlights appeared in the dark tunnel, casting long shadows across the platform, Martha took a step forward, ready for another ordinary Tuesday at the community center. She had no idea that in just moments, her routine day would turn into something extraordinary, connecting worlds that seemed impossibly far apart. The train wasn't coming after all, just the rumble of one passing on another track. Martha sighed and settled back onto the bench. The young man in the gray hoodie seemed to hesitate, then walked over and sat down at the far end of the same bench. Martha offered him a small smile. "Trains never run on time when you're in a hurry," she said. The young man nodded but didn't make eye contact. Up close, Martha noticed how thin he was, how his clothes hung off his frame. There were dark circles under his eyes that made him look older than he probably was. For a moment, she felt that familiar teacher's instinct. Something wasn't right with this boy. "Are you heading uptown?" Martha asked, trying to be friendly. The young man glanced at her, surprise flickering across his face at being addressed directly. "Yeah," he mumbled, then looked away. Martha opened her purse to check her phone, wanting to let the community center know she might be late. That's when she noticed the young man's eyes following her movements, zeroing in on her wallet. A small chill ran down her spine, but she dismissed the feeling. She taught in tough neighborhoods for decades. She knew better than to judge people based on appearance or a feeling. The station remained eerily quiet. The maintenance worker had moved to the other end of the platform. The woman with the phone had walked farther down to check the arrival times. The older man with the newspaper had dozed off, his chin resting on his chest. Martha heard the faint sound of another train approaching. She stood up, adjusting her purse strap across her body as she'd always done in crowded places. The young man stood too, a bit too quickly. The next few seconds seemed to happen in slow motion. The young man lunged toward Martha, grabbing her purse with both hands and yanking hard. The force of it spun Martha around, the strap digging into her shoulder before breaking with a snap. "Hey!" she cried out as she lost her balance, falling awkwardly against the bench. Pain shot through her hip and wrist as she tried to break her fall. The young man already had her purse clutched to his chest, backing away with wide, almost panicked eyes. "I'm sorry," he whispered, so quietly Martha wasn't sure she'd heard it. "Please," Martha said, reaching out a hand. "My medicine is in there. And my pictures." For a split second, the young man paused, conflict visible on his face. Then the sound of the approaching train grew louder, and he turned and ran toward the station exit. "Stop him!" Martha called out, her voice echoing in the station. The man with the newspaper jerked awake. The woman with the phone looked up, confused. The maintenance worker turned around, broom still in hand. But the young man was quick. He took the stairs two at a time, disappearing from sight as the train finally pulled into the station with a screech of brakes. Two strangers rushed to Martha's side, a middle-aged woman in scrubs and a young college student with a backpack. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" the woman in scrubs asked, helping Martha sit up properly on the bench. "Just shaken," Martha said, though her wrist throbbed and her hip felt bruised. "He took my purse. My heart medication is in there, and my phone, and—" She didn't mention the photos. The one of her late husband, Thomas, was irreplaceable. And the one with the famous actor who had become like family to her, that was private, special. "I'll call the police," the college student said, pulling out his phone. "What did he look like?" asked the woman in scrubs, who had introduced herself as a nurse at Harlem Hospital. Martha described the young man, his gray hoodie, his thin frame, the unexpected apology he'd whispered. "He looked hungry," she added softly, "and scared." The train doors opened, but Martha wasn't going anywhere now. Her day had veered far from her careful routine. No reading to the kindergartners today. No helping the older children sound out difficult words. As the nurse checked her for injuries and the student spoke with the 911 operator, Martha couldn't help wondering what would happen when her emergency contact got the call. Few people knew that her listed emergency contact would create quite a stir when he showed up. The young thief certainly had no idea who he'd just robbed or the storm that was about to come his way. The bright lights of the hotel conference room made Brad Pitt's blonde hair shine like gold. He sat comfortably in a leather chair across from a reporter who was asking questions about his newest film, a drama about family bonds that had critics buzzing about another Oscar nomination. "So the theme of chosen family seems to run through many of your recent projects," the reporter said, glancing down at her notes. "Is that something that resonates with you personally?" Brad smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling in that familiar way that had charmed audiences for decades. "Absolutely. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. I've been blessed to have both in my life." What the reporter didn't know, what most people didn't know, was that Brad was thinking of someone specific as he answered. Someone who had become family to him in the truest sense of the word, though they shared no blood relation at all. As the interview wrapped up, Brad checked his watch. It was just past 10:30. Martha would be at the community center by now, probably sitting in that worn armchair she loved, reading to the kindergartners. The thought made him smile. His own children had grown up with Martha's stories, her gentle voice bringing characters to life in a way that no one else could. He remembered the first time they'd met, 12 years ago. He had been looking for a reading tutor for his daughter, who was struggling with dyslexia. A friend had recommended Martha Johnson, a retired teacher known for her patience and innovative teaching methods. "Mr. Pitt," Martha had said when they'd first met, completely unfazed by his celebrity, "I don't care if you're famous. In this room, you're just a father who wants to help his child. And that's the only thing that matters to me." Her honesty had been refreshing. Over the weeks and months that followed, as his daughter's reading improved dramatically under Martha's guidance, Brad found himself lingering after lessons, sharing a cup of tea with the wise older woman who seemed to see right through the Hollywood facade to the person underneath. After losing his own mother, Brad had found in Martha a maternal figure who offered wisdom without judgment, love without conditions. They'd formed a bond that transcended their different backgrounds. She, a teacher from Brooklyn who'd spent her life in classrooms. He, a global superstar whose face appeared on billboards around the world. Mr. Pitt. His assistant's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Your car is ready whenever you are." Brad nodded and gathered his things. He had a meeting with his production company at noon, then dinner plans with an old friend. Just another busy day in a busy life. His phone buzzed in his pocket as he stepped into the elevator. Probably his assistant with some schedule change, he thought. But when he pulled out the phone, he saw an unfamiliar number with a New York area code. Something tightened in his chest. Martha was his only close connection in New York at the moment. Everyone else would contact him through his team. "Hello," he answered, trying to keep his voice casual despite the sudden worry. "Is this Mr. Pitt?" The voice was male and young. "I'm calling about Martha Johnson. You're listed as her emergency contact." The elevator seemed to drop faster than normal, a swooping sensation in his stomach that had nothing to do with the descent. "What happened? Is she okay?" The words came out sharper than he intended. "Sir, there was an incident at the subway station. Mrs. Johnson was robbed, and she took a fall. She's okay, but shaken up. The paramedics are checking her now." Brad's mind raced. Martha was nearly 80. A fall at her age could be serious. And what about her heart medication? She never went anywhere without it. "Where is she now?" he asked, already walking faster toward the hotel exit. "Still at the West 125th Street station. The police are taking her statement. Tell her I'm on my way. I'll be there in..." He did a quick mental calculation of the crosstown traffic. 20 minutes tops. As Brad ended the call, he signaled to his driver who was waiting outside the hotel. "Change of plans. We need to get to Harlem fast." The driver nodded, recognizing the urgency in his employer's voice. As the car pulled into traffic, Brad called his security team. Having bodyguards was usually about keeping overeager fans at bay, but today he was grateful for their connections. One call, and they'd be working with the police to find whoever had hurt Martha. Because that's what you do for family. And despite what the world might think looking at them, the aging black teacher and the white Hollywood star, family is exactly what they were. Nobody messed with Brad Pitt's F. The bright lights of the hotel conference room made Brad Pitt's blonde hair shine like gold. He sat comfortably in a leather chair across from a reporter who was asking questions about his newest film, a drama about family bonds that had critics buzzing about another Oscar nomination. "So the theme of chosen family seems to run through many of your recent projects," the reporter said, glancing down at her notes. "Is that something that resonates with you personally?" Brad smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling in that familiar way that had charmed audiences for decades. "Absolutely. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. I've been blessed to have both in my life." What the reporter didn't know, what most people didn't know, was that Brad was thinking of someone specific as he answered. Someone who had become family to him in the truest sense of the word, though they shared no blood relation at all. As the interview wrapped up, Brad checked his watch. It was just past 10:30. Martha would be at the community center by now, probably sitting in that worn armchair she loved, reading to the kindergartners. The thought made him smile. His own children had grown up with Martha's stories, her gentle voice bringing characters to life in a way that no one else could. He remembered the first time they'd met, 12 years ago. He had been looking for a reading tutor for his daughter, who was struggling with dyslexia. A friend had recommended Martha Johnson, a retired teacher known for her patience and innovative teaching methods. "Mr. Pitt," Martha had said when they first met, completely unfazed by his celebrity, "I don't care if you're famous. In this room, you're just a father who wants to help his child. And that's the only thing that matters to me." Her honesty had been refreshing. Over the weeks and months that followed, as his daughter's reading improved dramatically under Martha's guidance, Brad found himself lingering after lessons, sharing a cup of tea with the wise older woman who seemed to see right through the Hollywood facade to the person underneath. After losing his own mother, Brad had found in Martha a maternal figure who offered wisdom without judgment, love without conditions. They'd formed a bond that transcended their different backgrounds. She, a teacher from Brooklyn who'd spent her life in classrooms. He, a global superstar whose face appeared on billboards around the world. Mr. Pitt. His assistant's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Your car is ready whenever you are." Brad nodded and gathered his things. He had a meeting with his production company at noon, then dinner plans with an old friend. Just another busy day in a busy life. His phone buzzed in his pocket as he stepped into the elevator. Probably his assistant with some schedule change, he thought. But when he pulled out the phone, he saw an unfamiliar number with a New York area code. Something tightened in his chest. Martha was his only close connection in New York at the moment. Everyone else would contact him through his team. "Hello," he answered, trying to keep his voice casual despite the sudden worry. "Is this Mr. Pitt?" The voice was male young. "I'm calling about Martha Johnson. You're listed as her emergency contact." The elevator seemed to drop faster than normal, a swooping sensation in his stomach that had nothing to do with the descent. "What happened? Is she okay?" The words came out sharper than he intended. "Sir, there was an incident at the subway station. Mrs. Johnson was robbed, and she took a fall. She's okay, but shaken up. The paramedics are checking her now." Brad's mind raced. Martha was nearly 80. A fall at her age could be serious. And what about her heart medication? She never went anywhere without it. "Where is she now?" he asked, already walking faster toward the hotel exit. "Still at the West 125th Street station. The police are taking her statement." "Tell her I'm on my way. I'll be there in—" He did a quick mental calculation of the crosstown traffic. 20 minutes tops. As Brad ended the call, he signaled to his driver who was waiting outside the hotel. "Change of plans. We need to get to Harlem fast." The driver nodded, recognizing the urgency in his employer's voice. As the car pulled into traffic, Brad called his security team. Having bodyguards was usually about keeping overeager fans at bay, but today he was grateful for their connections. One call, and they'd be working with the police to find whoever had hurt Martha. Because that's what you do for family. And despite what the world might think looking at them, the aging black teacher and the white Hollywood star, family is exactly what they were. Nobody messed with Brad Pitt's family. Whoever the thief was, he had no idea what he had just set in motion. Whoever the thief was, he had no idea what he had just set in motion. The children at Little Stars Community Center were getting restless. It was 10:45, and Miss Martha was never late. Never. Rose, the center's director, checked her watch again. She'd known Martha for over a decade, and in all that time, the former teacher had missed her Tuesday reading session exactly twice. Once for her husband's funeral, and once for a hip replacement. "Miss Martha is probably stuck on the subway," Rose told the kindergartners who were squirming on their colorful floor cushions. "How about we start with a different story until she gets here?" But it wasn't just the children who were worried. Rose had a strange feeling in the pit of her stomach. At Martha's age, even a small delay could mean something had gone wrong. After starting the children on an activity with another volunteer, Rose slipped into her office and pulled out the emergency contact binder. She flipped to Johnson Martha and reached for the phone. The first time Martha had listed her emergency contact, Rose had nearly dropped the form. "This is a joke, right?" she'd asked. But Martha's serious expression had confirmed it wasn't. Over the years, Rose had gotten used to the idea, though she'd never actually had to make the call. Until today. She dialed the number, half expecting to get a manager or assistant. Instead, a familiar voice answered directly. A voice she'd heard in countless movies. "Mr. Pitt, this is Rose Washington from Little Stars Community Center. I'm calling about Martha Johnson." Inside the sleek black SUV racing uptown, Brad gripped his phone tighter. "What's wrong?" "I just got a call that she was robbed at a subway station." "Robbed?" Rose's voice rose in shock. "I didn't know that. She hasn't arrived for her reading session, and it's not like her to be late without calling. She's very reliable. Brad's worry deepened. Martha was supposed to be safe at the center by now. If she wasn't there and wasn't answering her phone. "I'm heading to the subway station where it happened now," he told Rose. "I'll call you when I know more." He ended the call and immediately tried Martha's cell phone again, straight to voicemail. Either her phone was off, or the battery was dead, or the thief had it. Brad pulled up an app on his phone, one he'd installed on Martha's phone months ago after she'd gotten lost coming home from a doctor's appointment. She'd reluctantly agreed to the tracking app, understanding his worry even as she insisted she was perfectly capable of finding my way around a city I've lived in for 50 years. "Thank you very much." The app showed her phone's last location before going offline, the West 125th Street station, confirming what the emergency caller had told him. The SUV hit a patch of traffic near Central Park, and Brad fought the urge to get out and run the rest of the way. His security guy in the passenger seat was already on another phone, talking in low tones to someone at the NYPD. "They've got officers and paramedics at the scene," the security man reported, covering his phone's microphone. Mrs. Johnson refused to go to the hospital. She keeps saying she needs to get to the community center because the kids are waiting. That sounded exactly like Martha. Stubborn as they come. The thought made Brad smile despite his worry. His phone buzzed with a text from his assistant, CNN calling for comment on new film. Also, meeting with studio pushed to 3 p.m. The everyday demands of his life seemed ridiculous right now. He sent back a quick reply. "Handle it. Family emergency." Because that's what this was. Martha wasn't his mother by birth, but she'd become the mother his heart needed after his own mom passed away. She was the one who sent him homemade cookies on location, who remembered his children's birthdays, who told him honest truths when everyone else was too intimidated by his fame to be real with him. "Can we go any faster?" Brad asked his driver. The driver, who had worked for Brad for years, understood the urgency. "I'll do my best, sir." Inside the SUV, Brad was already planning next steps. Once he knew Martha was truly okay, they would find whoever did this. Between his security team's connections and the police, they'd identify the thief. And then? Brad wasn't sure what then. The angry part of him wanted justice. But Martha would want compassion. She always saw the best in people, even when they were at their worst. The SUV finally broke free of traffic and picked up speed. Through the tinted windows, Brad could see they were getting close to Harlem. His hand hovered over his phone, wondering if he should call ahead, let someone know he was coming. But what would he say? "Hi, this is Brad Pitt, and I'm coming to check on the elderly black woman who was robbed because she's like a mother to me." He decided against it. Better to just get there and deal with the inevitable commotion his presence would cause. Right now, all that mattered was Martha. The SUV turned onto 125th Street, and Brad could see the subway entrance ahead. A small crowd gathered around it. Police cars with flashing lights. An ambulance. His heart raced faster. This was real. Martha was hurt. And someone was going to answer for that. The subway station entrance was crowded with police officers, paramedics, and curious onlookers. Brad's driver pulled the SUV as close as possible, and his security guard stepped out first, scanning the area. "Wait here until I clear a path," the security guard said. Brad shook his head. No time for that. He opened his door and stepped out, pulling a baseball cap low over his eyes. It took exactly 8 seconds before someone recognized him. "Is that?" "No way." "Brad Pitt." The whispers spread through the crowd like wildfire. Phones came out. People moved closer. Brad ignored them all, his eyes searching for only one person. The crowd seemed to understand something important was happening and parted slightly, creating a path toward the ambulance where a small figure sat on the back bumper. Martha was wrapped in a silver emergency blanket despite the mild day, looking smaller than Brad remembered. A paramedic was checking her blood pressure, while a police officer stood nearby, notebook in hand. "Martha," Brad called out, quickening his pace. Martha looked up, her expression changing from exhaustion to surprise to warmth. "What in heaven's name are you doing here?" she asked as he reached her side. "Don't you have that big meeting today?" Brad crouched down to her eye level, taking her hands in his. They felt cold. "The meeting can wait." "Are you hurt? What happened? Martha tried to wave away his concern. I'm fine, just a little fall. These nice people are making a fuss over nothing. The paramedic beside her cleared his throat. Sir, Mrs. Johnson has a sprained wrist and possibly bruised ribs. We've recommended she go to the hospital for x-rays, especially given her age and heart condition. And I've told them I'm not going to any hospital, Martha said firmly. The children are waiting for me at the center. Brad looked around, noticing for the first time how many people were watching them, phones recording the unexpected scene. His security guard was trying to keep people at a distance, but the crowd was growing by the minute. Maybe we should continue this somewhere more private, Brad suggested. The police officer stepped forward, clearly struggling to maintain his professional demeanor in the presence of a Hollywood star. Mr. Pitt will need a statement from Mrs. Johnson about the robbery. She's been waiting for someone to accompany her before she decides what to do next. Martha sighed. I've told them everything already. Young man in a gray hoodie, thin build. Took my purse with my medication, my phone, my wallet. And, her voice faltered slightly, the pictures. Brad understood immediately. The photo of Martha's late husband, and the photo of Brad with his arm around her, taken at his daughter's graduation, proof of a relationship they'd kept private for years. A relationship that wasn't going to be private much longer, judging by the growing crowd of onlookers. Officer, can we use your patrol car for a few minutes? Brad asked. I'd like to speak with Mrs. Johnson privately. The officer nodded, clearly starstruck. Of course, Mr. Pitt. This way. As they helped Martha into the back seat of the police car, Brad could hear the buzz of conversation from the crowd. Is that his mom? No way, his mom is white. Maybe she's like his nanny or something. Why is he here for some random robbery? Once inside with the doors closed, Brad turned to Martha. Tell me honestly, how badly are you hurt? Martha's tough exterior softened slightly. My wrist hurts something awful, and my side where I hit the bench. But mostly, Brad, I'm angry. Those pictures, the one of Thomas is the only copy I have. Brad squeezed her good hand. We'll get your things back. I promise. My security team is already working with the police. They'll check the security cameras, track your phone. Martha looked out the window at the growing crowd. You shouldn't have come yourself. Now everyone will know about us. The children at the center, their parents, everyone will treat me differently. Brad smiled gently. Would that be so terrible? For people to know your family to me? Martha's eyes grew moist. I never wanted to be seen as special because of you. I wanted to be just Martha, the reading lady. You are special with or without me, Brad said firmly. But right now, I need you to listen to me. You're going to the hospital to get checked out properly. Martha opened her mouth to protest, but Brad continued. The kids will understand. I'll call Rose and explain. And tomorrow, if the doctors say it's okay, I'll take you to the center myself. We can read to the kids together. Martha's expression softened at the thought. You'd do that? With your schedule? For you? Absolutely. A tap on the window interrupted them. The police officer was back, looking apologetic. Mr. Pitt, we have some news about Mrs. Johnson's stolen items. The station security cameras got a clear image of the suspect. We're circulating it now. Brad nodded. Good. Keep me updated. He turned back to Martha. Now, will you please go to the hospital? Martha sighed deeply, the fight going out of her. Fine. But not in the ambulance. It's a waste of resources. Brad smiled. We'll take my car. More comfortable anyway. As they emerged from the police car, the crowd had grown even larger. News vans were starting to arrive. Brad's security guard looked relieved when they headed for the SUV. Everyone's going to be talking about this, Martha murmured as Brad helped her into the back seat. About us. Brad smiled as he climbed in beside her. Let them talk. It's about time the world knew about the amazing Martha Johnson. As the SUV pulled away from the curb, Brad didn't notice the young police officer staring at the security footage on his phone. At the clear image of a thin young man in a gray hoodie looking directly at the camera as he fled with Martha's purse. A young man who had no idea he'd just become the most wanted thief in New York. The hospital waiting room buzzed with whispers. Despite Brad's security team's best efforts, word had spread that Brad Pitt was there with an elderly woman who had been robbed. Nurses kept finding excuses to walk past the private room where Martha was being examined, hoping for a glimpse of the Hollywood star. Brad sat in a chair outside Martha's room, baseball cap still pulled low, scrolling through his phone. His personal assistant had sent 17 messages about rescheduled meetings and press asking for comments. None of that mattered right now. His security chief, Dave, approached with a tablet in hand. "We've got something," he said quietly, sitting down beside Brad. On the screen was a clear image of the young man from the subway security camera. He couldn't have been more than 22 or 23. Thin face, hollow cheeks, eyes that looked too old for his years. "The police ran his face through their system," Dave explained. "His name is Luis Ramirez, 24 years old. Prior arrests for shoplifting and trespassing, but nothing violent. Last known address is a shelter in the Bronx, but he hasn't been there in months." Brad studied the young man's face. "He doesn't look like a hardened criminal." "He's not," Dave agreed. "Looks more desperate than dangerous. The police think he might be one of those kids who aged out of foster care and fell through the cracks." Something about that struck a chord with Brad. He played a character like that once, researched the statistics. Over 20,000 young people age out of foster care each year in America, and many end up homeless within a year. "What happens when they find him?" Brad asked. "Robbery charges, probably. Could get 2 to 5 years, especially since Mrs. Johnson was injured." Brad frowned. 5 years for a kid who looked like he needed a meal and a second chance. That didn't sit right with him, but it wasn't his decision to make. The door to Martha's room opened and a doctor stepped out. "Mr. Pitt, Mrs. Johnson would like to see you." Brad found Martha sitting up in bed, her wrist wrapped in a brace, looking annoyed at the hospital gown they'd made her wear. "What's the verdict?" he asked, taking a seat beside her bed. "Sprained wrist, bruised ribs, and a lot of fuss over nothing," Martha said, though her voice lacked its usual energy. "They want to keep me overnight for observation because of my heart." "Ridiculous." Brad smiled. "Maybe listen to the doctors just this once." Martha harumphed but didn't argue further, which told Brad she was feeling worse than she was letting on. "They found him," Brad said after a moment. "The young man who took your purse. His name is Luis Ramirez." Martha's expression softened. "Have they arrested him yet?" "Not yet, but they know who he is. It's just a matter of time." Martha was quiet for a moment, looking down at her bandaged wrist. "What will happen to him?" "Dave says he could get 2 to 5 years. Martha shook her head. "For a mistake made out of desperation, that seems excessive." That was Martha, always seeing the person behind the action. It was one of the things Brad admired most about her. "I saw his eyes when he grabbed my purse," Martha continued. "There was shame there. And when he whispered sorry, I believe he meant it." Before Brad could respond, his phone buzzed. It was Dave. "They found him," Brad told Martha after reading the message. "And your purse. He was trying to pawn your wedding ring at a shop in the Bronx. The owner recognized him from the alert and called the police." Martha's hand went to her heart. "My ring? Is it safe?" "They have it. And the photos too, apparently. Everything except the cash, which he probably already spent." Martha sighed with relief. "Thank goodness." "I don't care about the money, but Thomas's ring and our pictures." Brad squeezed her hand gently. "The police want to know if you'll press charges." Martha looked troubled. "Do I have to decide right now?" "No, you can think about it." Martha closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was resolve in her gaze. "I want to meet him." "Meet him? The thief?" "Luis," Martha corrected. "His name is Luis. And yes, I want to meet him. Before I decide anything, I want to look him in the eye and ask him why." Brad knew that determined look. There would be no changing her mind. "I'll see what I can arrange," he promised. Outside Martha's room, Brad found Dave waiting with more news. The story had exploded online. Hashtag Brad Pitt's mum was trending on Twitter. Entertainment news shows were leading with "Brad Pitt rushes to elderly woman's side after subway robbery," the surprising connection revealed. Privacy had always been important to Brad, but especially his relationship with Martha. She'd been his safe harbor, the one person in his life who treated him like a normal human being rather than a celebrity. Now that sanctuary was gone. But looking back through the doorway at Martha, who had finally dozed off in her hospital bed, Brad couldn't bring himself to regret coming to her rescue. His phone buzzed again. It was a text from Dave. Police station just called. They've got Lewis in custody. Want to know if Mrs. Johnson still wants to meet him. Brad looked again at Martha, sleeping peacefully despite everything that had happened. He thought about the young man in the security footage, about the desperation that might drive someone to steal from an elderly woman. Then he texted back, "Yes, tomorrow morning, and I'll be there too." Whatever happened next, Brad knew one thing for certain: Martha would approach it with the same compassion and wisdom she'd shown throughout her life. And maybe, just maybe, this unfortunate incident made Martha's hand went to her heart. My ring? Is it safe? They have it. And the photos too, apparently. Everything except the cash, which he probably already spent. Martha sighed with relief. Thank goodness. I don't care about the money, but Thomas's ring and our pictures. Brad squeezed her hand gently. The police want to know if you'll press charges. Martha looked troubled. Do I have to decide right now? No, you can think about it. Martha closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was resolve in her gaze. I want to meet him. Meet him? The thief? Lewis, Martha corrected. His name is Lewis. And yes, I want to meet him. Before I decide anything, I want to look him in the eye and ask him why. Brad knew that determined look. There would be no changing her mind. I'll see what I can arrange, he promised. Outside Martha's room, Brad found Dave waiting with more news. The story had exploded online. #Brad Pitt's mum was trending on Twitter. Entertainment news shows were leading with Brad Pitt rushes to elderly woman's side after subway robbery, the surprising connection revealed. Privacy had always been important to Brad, but especially his relationship with Martha. She'd been his safe harbor, the one person in his life who treated him like a normal human being rather than a celebrity. Now that sanctuary was gone. But looking back through the doorway at Martha, who had finally dozed off in her hospital bed, Brad couldn't bring himself to regret coming to her rescue. His phone buzzed again. It was a text from Dave. Police station just called. They've got Lewis in custody. Want to know if Mrs. Johnson still wants to meet him. Brad looked again at Martha, sleeping peacefully despite everything that had happened. He thought about the young man in the security footage, about the desperation that might drive someone to steal from an elderly woman. Then he texted back, "Yes, tomorrow morning. And I'll be there too." Whatever happened next, Brad knew one thing for certain: Martha would approach it with the same compassion and wisdom she'd shown throughout her life. And maybe, just maybe, this unfortunate incident might yet lead to something good. Yet lead to something good. The police station was unusually quiet the next morning. Word had come down from the top: clear the area, minimal staff, absolute discretion. It wasn't every day that Brad Pitt walked through their doors. Officer Chen led Brad and Martha through a side entrance to avoid the reporters camped outside. Martha moved slowly, one hand pressed against her bruised ribs, the other, now sporting a proper wrist brace, holding Brad's arm for support. "How are you feeling?" Brad asked quietly. "Like I've been hit by a truck," Martha admitted with a small smile. "But don't you dare tell those doctors I said so." They were shown to a small room with a table and 4 chairs. Not quite an interrogation room, but close enough that Lewis might feel the gravity of his situation. "He's pretty nervous," Officer Chen told them. "When we told him who was coming to see him, well, let's just say he didn't believe us at first." Martha nodded. "I imagine not." "Do you want me in the room with you?" the officer asked. Brad looked to Martha, who shook her head. "No, thank you. We'll be fine." After Officer Chen left, Martha took a deep breath. "I'm not sure what I'm going to say to him." "You'll know when you see him," Brad said, squeezing her good hand. A few minutes later, the door opened. Luis Ramirez entered, escorted by another officer who nodded to Brad before leaving and closing the door behind him. Luis looked even younger in person than in the security footage. His clothes, a faded t-shirt and jeans, hung loosely on his thin frame. His eyes darted from Martha to Brad and back again, wide with disbelief. "Sit down, son," Martha said gently, gesturing to the chair across from them. Luis sat, his hands fidgeting nervously on the table. "I don't understand why you're here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I wanted to meet the young man who knocked me down and took my purse," Martha said simply. "I wanted to understand why." Louis's eyes filled with tears. "I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you. I was hungry. I hadn't eaten in 2 days. I saw your wallet and—" He trailed off, unable to continue. Martha reached across the table with her uninjured hand. After a moment's hesitation, Louis took it. "Tell me about yourself," Martha said. "The truth, please." And so Louis did. He told them how he'd grown up in foster care after his mother died of an overdose when he was 8. How he'd bounced from home to home, never staying in one place long enough to make friends or feel like he belonged. How he'd aged out of the system at 18 with no support, no family, no guidance. How he tried to make it on his own, dishwashing jobs, stocking shelves, but couldn't afford rent in the city on minimum wage. How he'd been sleeping in subway stations for the past month after losing his room at a boarding house. "I was going to use the money for food and maybe a hostel for a few nights," Louis explained, his voice steadier now. "I didn't even look at the photos until later. I would never have sold the ring if I'd known it was your husband's." "I swear." Brad had remained silent, watching the interaction between Martha and Louis. He'd seen a lot of acting in his career, knew the difference between genuine emotion and performance. What he saw in Louis's eyes was real remorse. "I know I'm going to jail," Louis said finally. "I deserve it. I just want you to know I'm really sorry for hurting you." Martha glanced at Brad before responding. "Actually, that's one of the things we wanted to talk to you about. I haven't pressed charges yet." Louis looked up in shock. "You haven't?" "No, I wanted to meet you first. And now that I have—" Martha paused, seeming to make a decision. "I'd like to offer you an alternative." Brad leaned forward slightly. They'd discussed this last night in the hospital, but he wasn't sure Martha would really go through with it. "The community center where I volunteer needs help," Martha explained. "Cleaning, organizing books, setting up for events. It's not glamorous work, but it's steady. And there's a small room in the back that the director said you could use temporarily, just until you get on your feet." Louis stared at her in disbelief. "You're offering me a job? After what I did to you?" "I'm offering you a second chance," Martha corrected, "which is something every young person deserves. But there are conditions." Louis nodded eagerly. "Anything?" "You'll work at the center 5 days a week. You'll meet with a counselor once a week. You'll take GED classes, all tutored you myself. And you'll read to the kindergartners every Tuesday with me." "Why?" Louis asked, his voice cracking. "Why would you do this for me?" Martha smiled gently. "Because 50 years of teaching has taught me that people can change if someone believes in them. And I choose to believe in you, Louis." Brad cleared his throat. "There's one more thing. I'm starting a foundation in Martha's name to help young people who age out of foster care. Job training, housing assistance, mentorship. I'd like you to be our first participant." Louis looked between them, tears streaming down his face now. "I don't deserve this." "Perhaps not," Martha agreed. "But deserving has nothing to do with it. This is about who you can become, not who you were yesterday." After Louis was taken back to his cell, where he'd remain until the paperwork for his release into Martha's program could be processed, Brad and Martha sat quietly together. "Aren't you sure about this?" Brad asked finally. Martha nodded. "I've been teaching long enough to know when someone needs discipline and when they need compassion. That boy doesn't need jail. He needs a family." Brad smiled. "You know the media is going to have a field day with this. Brad Pitt and elderly woman adopt their mugger." Martha laughed, then winced as the movement hurt her ribs. "Let them talk. Maybe it'll inspire someone else to look beyond their first impressions." 6 months later, Martha sat in her usual chair at the Little Stars Community Center, Louis beside her, taking turns reading The Little Engine That Could to a group of wide-eyed kindergartners. The children loved him, especially the different voices he used for each character. From the doorway, Brad watched them, smiling. The Martha Johnson Foundation was now fully operational, having already helped 20 young people who had aged out of foster care find housing and employment. Louis was their success story, already halfway to his GED, working full-time at the center and mentoring other young people. The media frenzy had died down eventually. There had been talk shows and interviews and endless speculation about the unusual relationship between a Hollywood star, an elderly teacher, and a young man who had robbed her. But through it all, Martha had remained steadfast in her belief that people could change if given the chance. As Louise finished reading and high-fived each child, Martha caught Brad's eye and smiled. What had begun with a crime, a moment of desperation in a subway station, had transformed into something beautiful. Sometimes, Brad thought, the most meaningful family connections come from the most unexpected places, and sometimes the simple act of seeing the potential in someone can change not just one life, but many.